These projects start from the observation that today we are witnessing further intensification and accelerations of militarization processes, specifically in countercrime policies. Examples abound, from the war on drugs in Mexico, Venezuela, and Brazil, to criminalization of political oppositions in Pakistan, Kenya, and South Africa, to the militarization of public order and the fight against the so-called migration crime nexus in Europe and specifically in the UK. The fight against criminalized actors and phenomena is ever more defined through the direct involvement of military force, the adoption of military tactics and armaments by civilian police, the use of advanced surveillance technologies, and the adoption of warlike narratives and logics by political parties and governments. These trends require urgent investigation, and therefore this project aims to gather existing evidence on the effects of militarizing crime control, examining the different forms that this process takes, its impact on the social, political, and cultural fabric of our societies. To do this, we have assembled a range of expert scholars working on the issue, from Scottish universities as well as globally, to ask the following questions. What counts as militarization? What are the effects of militarization? What forms has militarization taken in the specific context and transnationally? What are its effects and how can we reverse militarization processes? The following video is a collection of these different insights on these questions, rely on a variety of case studies.
There's like a spectrum. There's actual deployment of the military in high violence situations. The military is actually deployed. And then there's kind of like the use of the military to support police operations. And then it's a kind of a militarization of police operations. So they use kind of rhetoric, discourse, Operation Crackdown, Operation Lockdown, all of these kind of military discourse. And the police themselves have become increasingly militarized over the years. So they also then deploy kind of uniforms that kind of have synergies with the militaristic connotations, and they all have semi-automatic rifles.
There's militarization of policing as the military doing the policing with the police. There's one which is the sort of tactics and technology that underpin how the military operate, which becomes co-opted by the police. And then for me, there's a sort of mindset thing, which is a key aspect of militarization.
There's a sense of urgency that justifies militarized responses, that everything has to be framed as an emergency or a threat. And that kind of risk creation, that kind of knowledge of risk, when it's generated, it can legitimize a lot of violence on the part of the state.
When you talk about militarization, like it really does not entirely involve the military. You need the entire set of political institutions, social institutions for the agenda or the intention to work.
We could talk about how transatlantic slave trade, the colonial infrastructure, the creation of policing and public security apparatuses has led to what we observe today. And there's a lot of continuity there. Dealing with this topic of militarization, we think of it as like a more modern, right, more contemporary way, right? The use of like tanks and helicopters and large, assault rifles for engaging in public security. But a lot of these militarized structures were inherited, right, from the very beginning of these institutions. I mean, the police originally were part of the military, especially in Brazil. So militarization is kind of fundamental.
Policing in Sindh today, it was tied to the 1861 Sindh Police Act, which was one of the first kind of colonial policing legislative frameworks that were designed under the British Empire. Subsequently, those frameworks and models of policing that were designed in Sindh traveled to other parts of British India. A lot of the legislation that kind of followed and the way the colonial policing structure of the institution was designed, that remains the same. For example, when the policing structure was designed under the British, the idea was that there would be elite police officers, a minority group sort of residing over subordinate police officials. And subordinate police officials would be the ones who would be kind of doing your street patrol, your beats, your investigative work, etc., etc. They would make up the majority of the force, and they would come from subordinate classes. It was a structure that was divided along class lines as well as sort of racial lines as well. First one, if we see in terms of their ethos and their values, policing in former colonies was never kind of meant to be about public service. It was always meant to be how do you protect the interests of the empire, economic interests, political interests? How can you kind of monitor and suppress anti-colonial movements? All of that meant that there had to be an enemy that was perceived. And the enemy was anyone who was not subjugated by imperial authorities. So that principle was always a guiding factor when there was a separate police force that was designed and subsequently thereafter as well in terms of how that police force was used. So that ethos, those principles and values were kind of instilled from the very beginning that there has to be an enemy other that has to be controlled in order to kind of maintain public order so that imperial interests will be protected. So it was never about policing communities. The broader political kind of interest that guides law enforcement agencies in these former colonies is the protection of imperial interests back then, and today, the protection of the state.
We have to go back to when the drug law in the Philippines has been legislated, and this was actually legislated during the martial law, the military rule of Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. And during this time, there was we have a very close relationship with the United States, and this was during Nixon and the drug war. And the country's drug law and the country's drug enforcement agency has been funded and trained. The agents were trained by the United States because during this time we have the military base as well. But it actually goes way farther than that because at the turn of the 20th century, when the Americans occupied the Philippines, I'm not sure if you're familiar with our history, 1898 and during that time, this was also during the height of opium prohibition, and it sort of like dovetailed with each other, the American opium prohibition campaign and also the colonization of the Philippines by the Americans. Of course, they refused to call it as such. And when the Americans came, the military tactic back then was to identify what they describe as criminal communities. So these are the anti-American, the Filipino insurgents. So this was at the turn of the 20th century during Duterte's campaign. You could actually trace how the police has also identified what they called drug-affected communities. And in a way, like being labeled as such already justifies the intensive policing and surveillance that they do, which is no different back in the colonial times.
For me, militarization is first of all a political process supported by powerful legitimizing narrative, and it is therefore crucial to ask what kind of politics it enables and what kind of politics is enabled by. I want to highlight here that militarization promotes a shift towards the right in the political spectrum of the debate. Let's talk about the case of Italy to illustrate that. Between 1982 and the summer of 1992, the narrative that the Italian state was at war with the Sicilian mafia assumed a central role in constructing and legitimizing the use of exceptional and emergent legislation. Crucially, on July 25, 1992, a new decree meant that more than 7,000 soldiers assumed the title of public security officers and were sent to Sicily. This was the Italian army's first domestic military mission post-World War II. In this context, the far-right party, Movimento Sociale Italiano, supported the government's decision while also claiming that further extreme measures were necessary, such as martial law and the reinstatement of the death penalty. This allowed the mainstream governing parties at the time to claim that their militarization was a reasonable and necessary measure to both win the war against the mafia while preserving democracy against the authoritarian temptation of the far right. In turn, this narrative disqualified any alternative discourse from the left contesting the militarized logic of war and limited the horizons of reasonable political discourse to degrees of militarization, rather than thinking about possible alternatives to it.
It's very much around taking back control narratives. The language is around restating order where order has been lost. So it's kind of order maintenance rhetoric. It's not crime prevention at all. It's not investigations. It's about taking back control. It's about state territorialization. Guy Lamb, based in Cape Town, he uses a great term because it police kind of frontierism, where kind of saturation policing to protect frontiers, to protect borders. And he argues that it's a lot to do with the synergies from the past. During apartheid, it obviously was kind of protecting white communities from the black masses, the black disorder, the black threat. And that's how it was framed during apartheid. To call it the swart gevaar, the black danger, literally. And so now he's arguing that there's kind of legacies in terms of the same rhetoric, these same speech acts, framing the same types of populations, where these areas are high violence crime areas, and there's rhetoric around the police having lost control, and that the military have to now step in to retain control of the situation.
If the authorities, if a policeman or a magistrate is in the presence of 12 people gathered together and thinks that they are rioters, can declare this a rioters assembly. From being an unlawful assembly, it becomes a rioters assembly, and a proclamation can be made to disperse in any way. So blow a whistle, tell these people to disperse, and these people should disperse. And from there on, the consequences of the people not dispersing mean that they are now a riot and they can be subject to life imprisonment. So it's a serious offense being an unlawful assembly. In other words, being together for a common purpose and creating fear in the society, if it's an unlawful assembly. But the transition to becoming a riotous assembly and defying a proclamation to disperse means that they attract life imprisonment. So that is significant, and that's Section 82 of the Penal Code of Kenya. But what accompanies that is an indemnity on the authorities against the use of lethal force, for the police to use unlimited force against any target for the reason that they have not dispersed in the context of being declared an unlawful assembly. Whether that person is threatening anybody's life or property, they can simply be shot without accountability.
Militarization creates the conditions for its own continuation. When the police go in and engage in a massacre or use violence to take out the leaders of these organizations, and no matter what happens subsequently, they can characterize that as success. If violence goes down, they say, look, what we did was necessary and we've improved public security. If it doesn't work and violence goes up, they'll say, look, these groups are actual enemies of order and peace, and therefore we need to militarize further.
My gateway to this topic was a particular policeman, a particular military man. It's called Agustin Lourenço. Agustin Lourenço was a military officer. He fought in the First World War, and he entered the Portuguese police in the late 1920s. And he became the head of what they call in Portugal the international police. It was political police and international police. He was surveilling and he was repressing revolutionary movements in Portugal, but it was also dealing with what he already called international criminals. And he became very integrated in international police networks. He became to go to what in 1945 would become the Interpol. Every year he would go to these meetings. In 1946, Portugal had one of the first meetings of the reformed Interpol, and he would become in the late 1950s, as he stepped away from the political police here in Portugal, he became the president of the Interpol. Becoming president of the Interpol was more an honorary post than an administrative thing. But even in an honorary capacity, I wanted, and I still want, to see our figure that was connected in Portugal with the torture of political dissidents became so inserted into international criminal policing networks.
So Comando Vermelho, the Red Command, its origins lie within one particular prison in the midst of the dictatorship during a period in which there had been a national security law that was passed, which said basically anyone who was robbing banks or financial institutions was considered a sort of enemy of the state and could be tried within military courts. At the time, there were a bunch of revolutionary groups, leftist, Marxist sort of revolutionary groups operating in Brazil that were trying to harass and combat the dictatorship. But there were a lot of other individuals and groups who were also engaged in bank robberies, maybe less of a leftist orientation, but very much stealing from the rich sort of ethos. And all of those individuals were put in the same prison. The history exactly of the relationship between those groups is still contested, but I would say that some of those individuals who were not already part of those organizations learned how to organize themselves. They were already politicized, many of them, because they had spent some time in prisons and had been, become familiar with sort of prison literature. But I think they understood how to create an organization and implement rules and the benefits of that, especially for prison populations, which in Brazil, I guess you could describe the conditions in most prisons, especially during the dictatorship, as kind of medieval, right? So there was a lot of abuse from the prison administration, from the guards, but as well amongst prisoners. So they realized that if they could solve that problem, then they could collectively organize and start making demands about improving those conditions. And that was the origins of what eventually became one of the largest drug trafficking organizations in Brazil and the world.
One of my main interests is thinking critically about long-term reintegration trajectories of ex-combatants. But what does it mean to ask the most vulnerable bodies in the process of undergoing this transition from militarization to demilitarization to shed all aspects of self and to be left unmoored to any social relations or familiarity? I wrote an article in 2022 about an organization in the United States that gathers veterans together to hike in their underwear to prevent veteran suicide. And they walk through like why their, bodily exposure, why their camaraderie, why their irreverence, why their bodiness is like a release from what they see as the strictures of the civilian world. So number one, it's like interesting that there can be a perception, and I'd say this is also true of ex-combatants in contexts that I've worked with in Africa, that the civilian world is a threatening one. That it's not that only the military world is a quote unquote militarized or securitized world. The civilian world is perceived as a world that threatens the bodies and minds of veterans and ex-combatants. It's not that you can just say to militarized bodies, demilitarize and shed the militarized masculine parts of yourself that are unproductive and ungenerative for our civilian society. On the criminalization part, it manifests itself most fully in kind of broader securitization discourses about ex-combatants, assuming in terms of like why you would even rationalize support to perpetrators in the first place. Discounting already, of course, complicated agency structure debates about how communities failed to protect individuals from being recruited into armed forces or failed to prevent war in the first place. So civilians are massively complicit in these structures, and the way like common understandings don't engage with that. But then beyond that is you help them, because if you don't, they will take the state back to war or engage in criminality. So it's that parallel track of return to war. So either a remilitarized future is projected onto the ex-combatant or a criminalized future. So they're seen as proximate to criminality. Again, their knowledge, experiences, and wherewithal are not seen as providing any kind of capital for peace, but only for criminal enterprise or insecurity.
there is variation within the UK. However, if you are looking at the UK compared to other nations in Europe, then some of those, the magnitude of those differences kind of disappears a little bit. So like if we're comparing policing in the UK to like France or, you know, some of the Baltic states or that kind of thing, then it is actually quite different. And that the UK has this principle of policing by consent, which, you know, we might come again to later, which at one level, it's perhaps more of an idea than a reality, but it does have real implications in terms of like UK police not being armed. The UK police are supposed to be responsive to their publics, whereas on the continent, police tend to be responsive to the state. So stop and search is one of those things that gets pulled out of the drawer every time there's some sort of panic around like knife crime, for example. We have this terrible problem with knife crime, more stop and search, that will keep people safe, but it's not stopping why people feel like they have to carry knives in the first place. I mean, that's the main parallel I can draw in terms of the UK compared to other countries who might reach for the military, you know, to do this aggressive response. In the UK, it's like, right, we're going to stop and search everybody. And that initially was what was happening in Scotland. And that's what kicked off the whole issue in the first place, is when the amalgamation happened in 2013, and it was the Strathclyde approach was rolled out across Scotland, addressing violence and knife crime. One of the first things they did was really intense stop and search, but they were just stopping and searching anything that moved and had a pulse. You know, it was just way over the top, and it was not actually effective. Because of that history, Scotland would be much less likely to revert to a stop and search solution to a problem like that. Although the other issue when you work in policing is that you realize there's so much change in people who hold various roles within policing, because there's always pressure to go on to another post, to try something new, to get promoted. So institutional memory doesn't really last long.
Now, what I think has occurred in Western democracies and in the UK in particular is an increased tendency to be quite intolerant of protests in terms of how they're represented, to view them as as threats to sort of state security and state interests. Technology is going to make it that disproportionality. Palantir is just the sort of the front page model of this sort of industry, but there are some huge industries now going, and what they can do with this technology now is just of a different scale. And how they're selling it, it's no longer boys, young graduates who have been recruited into these firms who are selling this with senior figures who have been taken out of government and stuff like that. And it's pretty scary. And I mean, you talk about, like, for instance, with technology, you can now take not just an individual's phone, you can take their entire family network, and you can actually interrogate every piece of data on that network for evidence of criminality using sort of open AI, using sort of more sophisticated AI. There's millions and millions and millions and millions of data points, and you can theoretically, you're not meant to legally, of course, you're not meant to do this. But again, if you're creating these sort of extra legal spaces where you feel undercover policing merits this, and there's a lack of transparency, there's sort of the technology can weaponize this quite significantly. The tech shows, which are essentially arms industry based driven tech shows, you know, Palantir is, well, what does Palantir do now? It does police, army, military, and it does health services as well. It's the key way I would distinguish between a militarized police force and a police force that is policing by consent with democratic accountability is that dialogue and that reach across. And there is definitely opportunity to strengthen that with new forms of policing, including technology, and that's through both scrutiny and accountability bodies. And we're gradually moving in that direction in some areas. But that just needs to be accelerated to some extent.
If you're thinking about the militarisation, I suppose the things I would think about in relation to policing in Scotland would be much more around the tactics being applied, the use of things like body-worn video, potentially, that are there to kind of almost provide some kind of authority to the interaction that's happening, and the ability to turn that on and off, which can be quite used in different ways by police. And the ability in a custody suite, for example, to have a conversation off camera and off mic, and then go on to camera and on to mic to explain what's happening, having made the decision off camera and off mic. So there's the use of technology like that in ways that really kind of highlights a power differential between the public and the police. And also, I guess, with the global geopolitics and the use of the kind of North Sea and the waterways around the north coast of Scotland become really quite important geopolitically for like Russian submarines, etc., or the tanker that the Americans held that ended up being sort of stationed off Orkney for a while. So, suddenly these sorts of places become quite important geopolitically, whereas if you kind of think about it at the local level, they tend to remain quite quiet backwater. So it's kind of interesting challenges or tensions between that global big P politics and the local community council small P politics and how the police kind of navigate that local relationship right the way up to the kind of global space that they end up just physically because of where they are geographically being kind of positioned in.
There are 3 key takeaway points we want to conclude on. Our examples show that militarization is not simply unidirectional, something that goes from the military into an otherwise peaceful society, but rather, as Michael Geyer already wrote it in 1989, militarization is a contradictory and tense political process in which civil society organizes itself for the production of violence. In this context, the military and civilian spaces are not assumed to be divided. Rather, the question becomes how processes of militarization are co-produced and co-productive of both. Second, and related, is that militarization processes are always linked to structural and intersectional dimensions of the societal fabric, such as race, class, income, gender, the rural-urban, and internal-external divides. The relevance of such dimensions to define patterns of militarization is increasingly more evident in contemporary discourses and practices surrounding migration, terrorism, organized crime, and political dissent. Third, and crucially, militarization relies on the logic of exceptionalism and emergency, and once these take hold, they tend to travel from one issue to another, making it extremely difficult to reverse militarizing paths.